Hi, Sean here, That History Guy, and we're continuing our investigation of the historical context of the James Bond movies. We're now up to the 14th Bond film, A View to a Kill, released in 1985, the last of the Roger Moore Bond films, and in the opinion of many people, the least. I actually don't share that view. Man with the Golden Gun will always be the low point for me, but I certainly understand why A View to a Kill usually ranks near the bottom of everyone's list of favorite Bond films. As Bond movies go, A View to a Kill is kind of an extreme outlier. There really is no other entry in the series quite like this one, and it's amazing to contrast how different this film is compared to its predecessor, Octopussy. A View to a Kill is sort of the punk rock heavy metal Bond film. If Octopussy, with its very Reagan-esque worldview, is a young Republican in polo shirt and khaki slacks, A View to a Kill is a punk rock kid with Liberty spikes, a safety pin through his lip, and a Sex Pistols God Save the Queen t-shirt. For that reason alone, it's pretty endearing, even if it's not a very good movie. The time it was made, 1984 and the first half of 1985, was the time when the United States and Great Britain reached what you might call peak 80s. Culturally, this was the era of Cyndi Lauper, Madonna, Michael Jackson in a sequin glove, and high body count Arnold Schwarzenegger films. Politically, after a few initial shaky years, the conservative regimes of both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher stabilized and settled into the status quo. Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party were overwhelmingly re-elected in 1983. Ronald Reagan was re-elected in 1984, facing only token Democratic opposition in the form of Walter Mondale, who posed no significant threat. The Cold War reached its late peak in 1983, the year Octopussy came out. In the second half of that year, after the film was released, the Soviets shot down an unarmed airliner. Ironically for our story, it was designated Korean Airlines 007. This plane was shot down over the Pacific, killing 269 innocent people and igniting the world's outrage against the Soviets. Less than a month later, on September 26, 1983, a computer in a Soviet military complex outside of Moscow indicated that an American ICBM had been launched and was inbound. The officer on duty that night, Stanislav Petrov, correctly realized that the launch detection was a computer error and did not authorize a counterstrike, a decision for which he was reprimanded by the Soviet authorities. How Petrov did not end up winning the Nobel Peace Prize for this, I'll never know. But the false launch incident of 1983 was definitely the closest that the superpowers came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although the Cold War was very tense, events were already in motion that would try to defuse the 40-year crisis between the superpowers. In November 1983, a television movie called The Day After, which dramatized a nuclear war and its immediate aftermath, was shown on American television, ABC, and was seen by over 100 million people, the most popular TV movie of all time. Ronald Reagan claimed in his memoirs that seeing The Day After galvanized his thinking and got him working toward peace. Whether this is true or not, there is some dispute about that. It is true that almost immediately after Reagan's second inauguration in 1985, he began a period of intensive diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union, which ultimately led to the INF Treaty. INF stands for Intermediate Nuclear Forces. This treaty banned the very same missiles that Reagan was so enthusiastic about deploying in Western Europe with such controversy. And we talked about that in the last video. Part of the reason for this timing was that the USSR, then well into its death spiral, went through a period of unstable leadership during Reagan's first term. Leonid Brezhnev, the guy with the eyebrows, he had been the Soviet leader since the mid-60s. But he died in 1982 and leadership passed to the terminally ill Yuri Andropov, former KGB chief and the boss of a certain agent named Vladimir Putin. Andropov himself croaked in 1984 and was followed by an even more decrepit leader, Chernenko, so old and sick that he literally had to be propped up to vote at party congresses. Essentially, the communist leadership could not figure out how to transition power to a new generation of leaders. A younger and more forward-thinking politician, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in March 1985, 2.5 months before the release of A View to a Kill. So let's talk about A View to a Kill. There is a softening in the Cold War hardline, at least a bit. The villain, Zorin, played by Christopher Walken, is supposed to have been involved with the KGB, but like most Soviet-connected Bond villains, he's gone rogue and his true purpose is his own. And that purpose is to destroy Silicon Valley, California with a massive earthquake, thus making his own stockpile of microchips much more valuable. Essentially, this is a remake of Goldfinger. The Goldfinger formula, as you recall, Goldfinger wanted to irradiate Fort Knox to make his own stockpile of gold more valuable. Microchips, which play a huge role in the story, are a nod to the role of computers in pop culture in the mid-'80s. In 1985, they were still just barely called microcomputers. I love that word, microcomputers. You don't hear it much anymore, so I'm going to use it as often as possible. Microcomputers, were huge in 1984 when the film entered production. 1984 was also the year that the Apple company released the Macintosh, and the year of the famous commercial directed by Ridley Scott, probably the most famous TV commercial of all time. So it was inevitable that in the peak 80s Bond film, you would have something to do with computers, microcomputers. In addition to microcomputers, View to a Kill channels another mid-80s pop culture obsession, MTV. Indeed, the film is as much about rock and roll as it is about computers. The villain, Max Zorin, was supposed to have been played by David Bowie, who, you have to admit, would have made an awesome Bond villain. And when he turned it down, the producer's second choice was Sting, another rock star, but he was a little embarrassed by his recent turn in David Lynch's Dune, in which he appeared in rock and roll vinyl underwear. In any event, when Sting turned them down, they snatched up Walken, who admittedly turns in one of the best ever performances as a Bond villain. The choice of henchman or henchwoman was also a rock star, Grace Jones, who portrays Mayday, again, one of the more memorable villains in the franchise. Combine this with the most popular theme song ever for a Bond film, at least in terms of Billboard charts. This is sung by Duran Duran, and you have all the ingredients of a rock and roll Bond movie, perfectly tailored for the MTV era. And I recall that in 1985, the theme song got very heavy rotation on MTV. Still, as much fun as it is, or should be, really not a lot works about A View to a Kill. Roger Moore was way too old, and he admitted this himself, and aside from the villains, none of the rest of the casting really works, especially Tanya Roberts, who plays probably the most uninteresting Bond girl in the entire series. She spends most of the picture hanging off of various high ledges and shouting, "James!" Very few of the stunts or action sequences really work. There's a fire truck chase through San Francisco that's just dull, a fight aboard a blimp that's tied to the Golden Gate Bridge. Yeah, I know. Really, the only thing that does work about this movie is a high jump off the Eiffel Tower. Although I have to say that the pre-credits sequence, which is a snow chase through Siberia, is definitely one of the more exciting pre-credit sequences in the series. So, A View to a Kill is a very mixed bag. Peak 80s, no doubt about that. It's fun and campy in its own way, but definitely one of the lesser films. And it was, mercifully, Roger Moore's last turn as the agent. After 12 years and 7 pictures, he finally hung it up. This left room for another reimagining of the Bond character, which I'll talk about in the next video concerning The Living Daylights. So join me there. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share on your microcomputer. Thanks.